Hi, everyone. A very good morning, a good afternoon, and good evening to all the other attendees, depending on where you are located. I would like to welcome you all to this particular webinar. I hope all of you are doing well and keeping safe. I see a few of them are joining. We'll just give it a minute before we kickstart this particular webinar. Okay, looks like we have a full house today. So thank you once again for joining this particular webinar, which is PCI DSS version 4.0, a step towards a better cybersecurity posture. Before we get started, let me introduce myself to you. My name is Prajwal, and I work as a principal consultant here in CISA. I basically work in the compliance and testing services. I've been in this particular industry for over a decade, with 10 plus years of experience, audited 500 plus organizations across the world, and I've trained close to 10,000 plus cybersecurity professionals. I'm a certified CISA, a PCI QSA, a P2PE QSA, a PCI 3DS QSA, tokenization Swift assessor, Swift ISO LALI, and a certified lead trainer from CISA. CISA is a global forensic cybersecurity-driven organization solutions company trusted by organizations across the globe for securing their businesses with their robust preventive, detective, corrective security services and solutions. We apply the power of our forensics intelligence and advanced technology to offer true security to 2,000 plus customers in 40 plus countries. And we are a top 4 global PCI forensic investigators for the payment industry. With 4.0 coming into the picture in Q1 early 2022, the 31st March 2022 to be precise, this webinar, we will basically address the most important security concerns, transitions, changes, the goals of 4.0 that is coming into the picture predominantly. And we also address the evolving threat landscape in the payment security space, and also how organizations to kickstart their particular journey towards PCI DSS version 4.0 implementation if we've not kickstarted as yet. So before we kickstart with the webinar, a few things that I want to basically, ensure we have on this particular forum. This webinar is basically going to be for 60 minutes, which is going to be including 15 minutes of question and answer session. So we basically do this webinar, say, predominantly for 45 minutes, and the last 15 minutes is up for question and answers. So you can feel free to put in your questions on the chat, or you can unmute yourself during that particular piece and answer these questions. For the first 45 minutes, all attendees will only be on mute. Let me quickly introduce the speakers to you today and the panelists on this particular forum. We have Nitin Bhatnagar, who is basically the Regional Director, India and Southeast Asia, PCI Security Standard Council. Nitin is having predominantly 15 plus years of experience in the payment security space. He's also listed in the top 50 cybersecurity leaders of India in 2021. He works with the payment brands, assesses community, participating organizations, government, and regulators. Welcome, Nitin. Next, on the particular panel, we have Mr. Laik Ul Rahman, who's basically the Assistant Vice President, InfoSec Governance, Risk and Compliance, 24/7 AI. He's worked in the management and the leadership distinctions with over 20 plus years of experience. Focus areas is obviously in terms of innovation and global change management, experience in Six Sigma, corporate governance, risk management, continuous compliance automation, information security, best practices, and so on and so forth. So the key points for our discussion in this particular webinar, again, just reiterating the entire gist, is we'll be talking about the timelines for implementing PCI DSS version 4.0, steps with transitioning from version 3.2.1 to version 4.0. I think this is something which is very, very important. PCI DSS version 4.0 and how multi-factor authentication or multi-factor authentication, the standard emphasizes on this particular piece, and also authenticated scans, which is very, very important. So we'll talk about that particular factor. Importance of adopting tools in terms of version 4.0, We also talk about a defined approach versus a customized approach, because we know that with version 4.0 coming into existence, we move towards a risk-based approach where we have something called as targeted risk analysis and so on and so forth. So we talk about a defined approach versus a customized approach. And last, we also talk about log monitoring, because this is something which is very important as part of 4.0 and also incident response. So this is what we are going to basically cover as part of our particular agenda today. So moving forward, I will basically hand over to Nitin Bhatnagar, who's just going to talk about how the PCI standards has basically, evolved over a period of time. So Nitin, off to you. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you. Thank you, Prajwal. Hope everyone can hear me, and very good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So wherever you are joining in for this webinar, and thank you, CISA, for inviting us to be part of this much valued session on PCI DSS version 4.0, which has been talked at this point, and the industry has been really aggressively working on to meet the requirements of PCI DSS version 4.0. But before that, I have something to really highlight on who we are as PCI Security Standard Council and what's our goal. And what you see on the screen is the standard revision history that we have made since starting off developing of the standard since 2005. Now, talking about the goals, I think the primary goals for the PCI Security Standard Council has been to secure the payment data in a rapidly evolving ecosystem and to promote security as a continuous process, and also improve flexibility for organizations using a broad range of methods and technologies. And lastly, the last goal for us has been to enhance validation methods and procedures. I think we are going to talk in this today's session. The speakers are going to talk about it. And we are going to, from the PCI point of view, we are going to touch point on the implementation timelines and how this is going to help you in securing the payment data. So the PCI Security Council has evolved the PCI DSS to support a range of evolving payment environments, technologies, and methodologies for achieving security. So for PCI, if I have to be specific to PCI DSS version 4.0, the 12 core PCI DSS requirements remains fundamentally the same. Now, the several new requirements, address evolving risk and threats to the payment data, and to reinforce security as a continuous process has been taken into consideration when we talk about the PCI DSS version 4.0. The timelines that you see, the major revision of the standards that we have done. We have the minor or the other revisions that we have done on the standards since we started. The development of various standards. So 15 data. Today we have 15 data security standards that are required to be adopted and in order to protect the payment data that you are holding. If you're storing, processing, and or transmitting them, right? So the history for the standards, the revision of the standards have happened from time to time whenever there has been a significant change in the industry. When we are talking about new emerging technologies, we are talking about evolving environments. That's where the PCI Security Standard Council has been working. We have been constantly requesting feedback from the industry, from the participating. I would like to thank participating organizations from India and South Asia who are aggressively and continuously been giving us those feedbacks in order to improve and influence the standards from the region perspective. So that's what is all that PCI focus has been, and we are on our path to get to a stage where we keep making sure that we make these standards more robust. And we again would need your inputs, feedback, and continuous support to make these standards more robust to help secure the payment data. Over to you, Prajwal.
Perfect. Thank you, Nitin. I think the standards have been evolving over a period of time. And thank you so much for all the particular insights that you basically provided with respect to the standards and how it's been evolving. So we can move forward, please. Yeah. So this is just a quick crux about the entire PCI DSS implementation and the timelines that has come into the picture, because all of us are aware about this, that the version 4.0 of the standard was basically released early March. That 31st of March 2022 is when the standard came into existence, and we have a 3-year transition cycle, that is until the 31st of March 2025, by which all organizations have to go with 4.0 implementation. Correct? So now what comes into the picture is, we have a lot of people asking us questions, whether can we kickstart our journey towards 4.0 right away, or do we have to wait, over a period of time to start this? So this is what we'll be covering in this particular webinar as well. So just to give you a small heads up, it's important for you to, kickstart this particular 4.0 journey as soon as possible. The reason being, the entire standard is again defined or, broken down into two main requirements, which is something called as evolving requirements and mandatory requirements. So if an entity or organization is going ahead with 4.0 implementation right away, then, you can basically go ahead and meet the actual mandatory requirements and still get certified. And for the evolving requirements, you have a particular timeline till 31st of March 2025 to implement, which means after 31st of March 2025, these requirements become mandatory, right? Which means you have to be compliant to these particular requirements before the particular set date. And also, in the interest for everybody on the forum, version 3.2.1 retires on 31st of March 2024, right? So this is also something which is very, very important, so that we plan our journey towards the entire version 4.0, which is coming to the picture. So having said this, let's move forward, please. Yeah. So Nitin, I think, we just spoke about how, the standards have basically evolved over a period of time. And when we started off way back in version, 2006, when PCI DSS version 1.0 was released, and now we are on version 3.2.1. So just want to know from your end, because I'm pretty sure that you've been getting a lot of questions as well from the industry and so on and so forth. What are the timelines and, can organizations go ahead and start implementing? Because being assessors and, auditors as well, we have a lot of questions coming in saying that, hey, can we start our journey towards 4.0? When do we kickstart this? Do we, have ample amount of time? So just want to hear your thoughts, Nitin, on this.
Sure, Prajwal. I think I'll go back to the last year. I think 6th April or 7th April, if I remember the date correctly, we did a webinar with CISA, and I think that's where my implementing PCI DSS was a 2-year project. So that's what I highlighted. It's a 2-year project, and I think you should start your journey now. Probably then April 6, 2022. Now, again, you're just left with 1 year now. I think again, if we talk about just thinking about 31st March 2024. Okay, we'll wait for 31st March 2024 to come and then we start. I think it will be too late. So I think idea is to emphasize on start now if you have not started, because the time passes. I'm sitting after 1 year in the same doing the same webinar. Just time passed. It just flight like anything, right? So my idea is very simple. The methodology remains the same, using the plan, do, check, act in old age principle. I'll still say that planning and planning was something, if you have not done it, you can still do it. You have to stretch yourself, but start planning. First thing, start reading the new standard and understand all the changes that have been made, and importantly how they're going to impact your organization or affect your, not impact, I think impact is the wrong word. It's going to be affecting your organization. Once you're done with that, set up task forces. Do set up your task forces and groups to start implementing the necessary changes for your organization. Once you are done with that, check with your QSAs, or you have to work with your QSAs. In fact, the QSS plays a very, very important role here. The organizations, the stakeholders have to work very closely with the QSAs, because they are trained by the trainers on the PCI DSS version 4.0 to carry out different audits, right? So you have to work with the QSs to carry out a gap analysis, understand and have your QSA undertake a gap analysis to a point out where the changes need to be made to ensure you meet the new requirements. Very important. That's the reason I'm emphasizing that using the expertise of your qualified security assessor is very, very critical. Once you are done with that, I think you have to act implementing the necessary work that you have been doing, so that your 2024 assessment, when you're going to do it, you're still meeting the PCI DSS requirements. Otherwise, if you're just thinking of 31st March 2024, you can just think around how this is going to impact you if you are not ready with your plan, do, check, and old age principle of getting things put in place. So starting now, to answer that question, if you have not started, start it today. Touch base with your QSAs so that at least they can guide you in a right direction.
Fantastic, Nitin. I think, you've just put this up in the right form and right format. It's always important for us to start right away. I think that is the key takeaway from this particular question, because like you rightly mentioned, it's not about waiting till version 3.2.1 retires and then going ahead and implementing 4.0, because, the time frame which is coming into the picture is going to be bare minimum, right? In terms of implementing these particular controls, because over a period of time, like I rightly mentioned as well before, the evolving requirements become mandatory and it is going to become a nightmare to implement them if in case you wait until that period of time. So Rahman, just a question to you. You have any thoughts about this as well?
No, I think you and Nitin have covered it well, right? Do not procrastinate, right? If you have not started, it's a time for you to start right now, which means to say right now, PCI is still giving us timeline for the organization to get familiar with the changes, right? So as a best practice, right, if you have a solid team who can assess, go ahead and do the assessment, do the delta gap assessment where you stand, or take support from your QSA. Or the other thing to look across is in case you're renewing your PCI 3.2.1 certification, you can go ahead and do an assessment in terms of with 4.0, where do you stand? What are the sections which you need to focus on, right? From what I see is, right, the changes I see are divided predominantly into two parts, right? One is the methodology changes, which PCI DSS is talking about, and the other one is the new requirements, right? The way I see across is the methodology changes are like pretty much like a low-hanging fruits, okay, which are predominantly like documentation changes, which might be with respect to roles and responsibilities, where PCI DSS is focusing more, right? A lot of frameworks with respect to RASI, which can be used, which can be picked across and moved across, right? They also talked about a lot of changes with respect to security policies and procedures, which can be looked into it, and look across the way of how you need to do a targeted risk assessment, right? And now very important is continuous compliance is more into focus, right? So for instance, the new changes which says that go back and confirm the scope of your PCI DSS, right? Are you doing it every 6 months? If you need to do it more often, depending on your infra, depending on your chain management, you need to do that across, right? The other thing which will be, which I feel would be like, where most of the people have questions in terms of what are the new changes, where should I invest, what are the new requirements, what are the new technologies which is there, right? So this is the new requirements, which will be a long lead item, right? Which is sometimes where you have to invest in new technologies. You have to invest in the risk maturity, depending on the risk maturity of your organization, right? So there are a lot of new requirements which have come across. So it's important that we start looking that into more detail and start looking into, let's say for a second, think about like phishing attacks, right? This is something which is new, right? It's just not only putting a technology controls there, but also going ahead and doing more exhaustive training with respect to the team, right? Because the way we see across most of the time, we implement technology, but also your human firewall is also what I call across, should also play a critical role to secure your or meet your PCI DSS requirement, right? Just don't think about PCI DSS requirement, but think about how you want to secure your organization, right? So there are a lot of changes which are there. I can just think a lot of things, but what comes to top of my head are like, with respect to privilege access reviews, which are there, right? Removal of access media, which is there. Audit logs are something which are a very, very new requirement, which we should focus on. I think while we move ahead, we'll talk more about scanning requirements, which are coming into place, all right? So for some of the organization where I see like practically challenges like the chain management, right? Sometimes you might get an approval from your budget controllers, but sometimes when you want to go ahead and do the change, you'll have some issues coming across where you have to take approval from your customers, clients, right? So do all those things. From what I'm talking predominantly is from a BPO environment, right? Because in BPO, every minute or every second is money, right? Think about your change, be careful, right? What changes you're making, right? Ensure it does not impact your customer or business.
All right. Yeah, thanks, Rahman. Nitin, you've raised your hand. I think you want to say something.
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. I think, Rahman just highlighted something on phishing. And I think authentication requirements have evolved in the PCI DSS version 4.0, and there has been a new requirement to detect the phishing attacks. Phishing was one of the area that Rahman just highlighted, and there are two new requirement for 5.4.1 and 12.6.3.1. So first, for the requirement is to processes, to automate the entire mechanism to detect and protect the personals against the phishing attack. And the second requirement, which is 12.6.3.1, is largely focusing on the security awareness training exclusively for phishing and related attacks and social engineering attacks. So that's something that I just thought I'll add on to it, because these are the two new requirements which has been added to the PCI DSS version 4.0, and which is very critical for the organizations to protect themselves from being victim of these attacks.
Perfect. Okay. So thanks, Nitin and Raman. I think just to summarize the entire, just before we move forward, I think the timelines aspect of it is what is important. So just to give you a small heads up, the version 4.0 came into the picture on 31st of March 2022. That is when the standard was basically released. There's a 3-year transition cycle, that is until 31st of March 2025, by when organizations have to basically meet all of their PCI DSS requirements for version 4.0. Version 3.2.1 of the standard expires, or retires rather, on 31st of March 2024, right? So this is something which is very important. Now, coming back or circling into whether organizations can implement 4.0 right away, that's my recommendation as well. And I think that's what the panelists are also just mentioned, that it's important for you to kickstart the journey as soon as possible, because, the entire standard is, again, the version 4.0 that has come in is bifurcated into evolving and mandatory requirements, where, you can go ahead and implement the mandatory requirements which come into the picture right away, and you can still get certified on version 4.0. And then over a period of time, you can go ahead and implement the evolving requirements. But for the interest of the audience here, please remember, the evolving requirements become mandatory post 31st of March 2025, which means if you've not implemented these particular evolving requirements by then, you become non-compliant to version 4. So that's why I'm saying that, there's very minimal amount of time. So please kickstart your journey. And that is something which is very, very important. Yeah.
Yeah. Prachul, just one last comment on this point. I
Yes.
think the transition timeline, just a correction, it's 2 years. So it ends on 31st March 2024. So the transition from version 3.2.1 to version 4.0 is until 31st March 2024, because on 1st April 2024, you have to by default have an implementation or the assessment done on version 4.0, because 3.2.1 is going to get retired. Yes, you rightly said on 31st March 2025 is your for the new best practices, requirements of the best practices, which will affect which are going to be effective post 31st March 2025. Until then, their best practices can be implemented, or probably you can start working on those lines to make sure that you are ready by the time it becomes an actual requirement.
Absolutely. So that's where I was also coming into the picture, saying that, version 3.2.1 retires by that particular period, that is 31st of March 2024, which means organizations post that particular timeline have to be certified on version 4. Yeah. So
perfect.
Yeah. So let's move forward, and then we can probably take the questions that come in. So Nitin, I think, we just spoke about the entire transition. We spoke about the timelines. We spoke about the journey, and we said, start ASAP. I think that is something, which was a key takeaway as well. So I have a question again. What are the first steps that organizations should take when they're transitioning from version 3.1 to 2.1 to 4.0? So, we spoke about the evolving requirements. We spoke about the mandatory requirements, and so on and so forth. So 1 or 2 pointers around this piece, please.
No, I think I already answered that question, but I think emphasis is start immediately as possible today, because time is just running. I think we have already talked about that old principle of plan, do, check, act. I think just follow that. I think that's the only thing that I would request all these stakeholders from the industry. And importantly, if you are basically implementing version 4.0 and you're using the approaches that you are using a customized approach, definitely we'll talk about that. Start now. Get engaged with your QSAs, and if at all required, also have ISAs get the internal security assessors trained internally, so that your journey will be faster and quicker in terms of getting through this all phases of plan to check it quickly.
I think that's fantastic. And then, like you rightly highlighted before as well, that the QSAs are also trained on the version 4.0. I think that was a fantastic thing which was also done, because even though you were certified on version 3.2.1, and when version 4.0 came into the picture, the QSAs had to take up this extra piece of the certification program to get certified on version 4.0, so that even as assessors we understand what are the changes, and then we can go ahead and suggest the right set of controls coming into the picture, right? So yeah, fair enough. I have a couple of questions, so I think we'll take 1 or 2 questions and then we can take it forward. So the first question that has come into the picture is, can you please explain about the evolving requirements and how do you identify them? And that is a particular question. So Nitin, you want to take that? It says, can you please explain about the evolving requirements and how do you identify them? Nitin, you're on mute.
Okay, sorry, I'm really sorry. So the evolving requirements have come around, for example, there are a couple of things, I think multi-factor authentication has been a new requirement, which is a new evolving requirement that has come. There's a requirement on the password and passphrases that has come in. Largely, I emphasized on authentication. So PCI standards version 4.0 is largely focusing on the authentication requirements. It has given a lot of emphasis on how you should be looking at the threat landscape. I think this is not just we did it, but the industry feedback and consideration into the kind of threat landscape that is throwing this several changes onto the authentication requirements in PCI DSS version 4.0. So multi-factor authentication, there is a new requirement altogether, which is going to be effective 31st March 2025 for a MFA implementing all access to the CD. Now there is an updated standard, includes a clarification also on multi-factor authentication that is, is required for both access into the CD and remote access also originating outside the entity's network. And that is applying it to one type of access does not replace the need to apply other MFA for the other access. So that's one requirement that has evolved. The second is on the password and passphrase. So we have increasing the password length from 7 characters to the 12 based on the feedback that the 7 characters is no longer sufficient based on the modern computing power. Now the 12 characters length is also going to be effective from 31st March. You still have time to use them as a best practices, but you have to start migrating yourself to that or transition yourself or making those changes. So now that's one thing that has happened. So we have also retained the requirements to change password every 90 days, since for entities passwords are the only protection they use, and changing them periodically can prevent formerly the breached ones from being reused. Now, however, the requirements, to change passwords will only apply to systems without MFA. So example here would be if the multi-factor authentication is not implemented on systems that are in scope, but not in the cardholder data environment. For systems protected with MFA, this password change requirement can be marked as not applicable. So that's a change that has come. The new requirements. Talking about the group shared and generic accounts in version 3.2.1, if Prajwal can add on to it when I complete this, use of these accounts was prohibited, right? And this requirement was modified in version 4.0 that now the entities may use them if their use is managed. That is exceptional circumstances only. Please mark my word, don't make me accountable for this. It is only for the exceptional circumstances only, limited time frame, justification and approval, confirmation of user identity and action attributable to the individuals is important here. So that's when the SSS are coming for this particular requirement on the shared generic accounts and group accounts. I think that's something that is required. Now, overall, these are the new requirements that have been added into the standard. And I'm sure when you are implementing the PCI DSS version 4.0, when I talk about plan, do, check, act, again I'll say, please go back and read the standard, because that's going to be critical for you to understand the changes. Go through the summary of changes from version 3.2.1 to version 4.0 to make yourself ascertain the changes that have come in, how they're impacting you. And that's where I said, work with your QSAs so that you understand your environment and you are smooth in your journey towards accomplishing PCI DSS version 4.0. So once the version 3.2.1 retires, you're not blank, or probably you're not. You don't have to you have to restart everything once, right? So start now. Still, you have 1 year. Probably next year when I come and talk about on 31st of March 2024, I should be hearing, Prajwal should be saying, Nathan, I think this webinar really helped the audience and they have all into version 4.0. We don't have any one single one who's asking us to do on version 3.2.1.
Awesome. I think within that is very well structured as well. And I think just to, just for the benefit of everybody, I think there is also these documentations which are available on the PCI DSS website, right? Which basically predominantly talks about the changes that has come into the picture from version 3.2.1 to version 4. So I think this is something, for the people who are asking this particular question, if you want to know what are the evolving requirements, what are the mandatory requirements, You can also go back. It is a publicly available document, which is there on the PCI DSS website. So you can just go ahead, look into that, and this will, give you in detail what are the changes that has come into the picture. And again, the changes are bifurcated into what is evolving and what is mandatory. So post that particular piece, you can also, like what Nitin was rightly saying, that you can talk to your QSAs, look into these particular requirements for better understanding, and you can take that particular thing forward, right? So that is something which is very important. There is another question which has basically come up. As an auditor, how can we get to do QSA certification from CISA? Okay, so please remember this particular piece that CISA is basically not somebody who can certify you saying that you are a QSA, which is a qualified security assessor. This is basically a sole certification which is provided by PCI DSS. So for you to basically become a PCI QSA, first of all, your organization has to be QSA and it has to be certified and listed on the PCI DSS website. And then you have to be a part of that particular organization for you to be a QSA, right? So ideally speaking, the certification is not provided to you by CISA per se, because this is governed by PCI DSS. Now, if you want to become a qualified security assessor, you'll have to join one of the QSA companies. You have a particular prerequisite which comes into the picture, that is minimum requirements, and then you can basically go ahead with your certification aspect of it, right? So this is something to answer that particular question. So anyway, Nitin is again, from the PCI DSS. So Nitin, you want to add anything on that? Yeah, please.
I think the question from Vikrant looks like to be very simple. He's looking for your services.
Okay. So yeah, so that is one particular question. So again, moving forward, I have another question which has come in. So I see this particular question from, Nikhil. Yeah, so Nikhil, I see you've written PCI DSS certification is valid for 1 year. Assuming there's no explicit revocation, no breach, assuming my organization gets PCI DSS version 3.2.1 certified on 30th of January 2021, will my organization certification expire and no longer be valid on version 3.2.1 as the program retires? In other words, will I have to start doing certification immediately within the quarter after Jan 2024 for PCI DSS version 4.0? Please help me understand. That's a very, very good question because I think a lot of them also have this particular question. And once we answer this, a lot of things gets answered. So Nikhil, to answer your particular question, like I told you before as well, version 3.2.1 retires on 31st of March 2024. Now, if you are certified on version 3.2.1 in January per se, now, yes, the certification cycle is going to be annual, right? But it is still going to be valid over a period of time, that is for one particular year until 2025. But then the pain point that comes into the picture is you will have very bare minimum time for you to go ahead and implement these particular controls from a version 4.0 standpoint. So what we intend to do for organizations is we try to educate our particular customers and tell them that, hey, if you're going for your certification in 2023, it's always good to basically start your journey towards version 4.0 so that you know where you stand. So in a nutshell, to answer your particular question, if you're certified on January 2024 on version 3.2.1, it still remains. You still remain compliant to version 3.2.1 because it is an annual recertification cycle. I wouldn't say recertification, but it's a revalidation, right? Because you need to maintain your particular controls and so on and so forth. But yes, the only intent of this is you'll have bare minimum time to implement these particular requirements, because like I told you, the evolving requirements will become mandatory post 31st of March 2025. And if you do not have that particular time frame and your environment is not, assessed according to this, then you become non-compliant. So this is something. So Rahman, you want to add something to this particular question?
No, in fact, I will. Thanks. We don't have to wait till the last minute, right? Because tomorrow we don't know what regulations might change, right? For instance, your customer might come back and say, hey, I'm not going to give you business because you're not PCI 4.0 certified, right? So why wait, right? Start right now, get a Delta assessment completed, know what is there, right? Because don't wait till 2025, I think so. We don't have to do that.
Fantastic. So I think that is something which is very, very important. And also I have another question which is come into the picture where, I have a question which is saying that, so you recommend for PCI DSS version 4.0 gap assessment, instead of doing 3.2.1 gap assessment, should we focus on 4.0 assessment this year? Absolutely bang on, which means you understand the entire discussion. I think that was the intent as well for all of us. It's important for you to kickstart your particular journey because we know there's a particular transition cycle that is provided. It's about 3 years for you to get certified on that piece. But then what is important is do not wait until this particular standard retires and so on and so forth, because implementation becomes tedious, right? So, yep, I see there are a lot of questions coming into the picture. It's just in the interest of time, I'm just going to move forward. We will answer all of these questions again. So let's move forward, please. We can go ahead with the next one. Yeah, so I saw there's a question which has come into the picture with respect to multi-factor authentication as well. So we'll take that with this. So this particular question, so Rahman, this question is to you. What do you think are basically the controls and emphasize on multi-factor authentication with version 4.0 coming into the picture?
See, with the PCR thing, right, a lot of things have changed, right? For instance, even if talking about scan, right? So your internal vulnerability scans also have to be more authenticated right now, more than before, right? Your MFA also is now increasing day by day, right? So we can talk about more in detail. Maybe I would require you or Nitin to get more detail on MFA there, so I can just pitch in from a practical perspective there.
There, Raman. So in the interest of time for everybody, please remember the multi-factor authentication requirement which came into the picture from version of 4.0 is earlier, the 3.2.1 standard was only for administrators, right? Who have basically administrative access to CDE. So the requirement was cardholder data environment. So administrators only who basically having access to this particular CDE aspect of it. So these administrators required multi-factor authentication, right? So the requirement, just to give you a heads up, it says administrators with non-console access to the CDE, you had multi-factor authentication, but now the requirement is changed from 4.0. It talks about all users, right? So that is something which is very important. All users who have access to CDE. CDE is nothing but the cardholder data environment. So people who understand the standard, these are category 1 devices which store, process, and or transmit something called as the account data piece of it. So for them, multi-factor authentication earlier it's for administrators, but it's for all users. So I'm going to answer one particular question out there because there's a question that is coming into the picture that do we have to implement multi-factor authentication even for tokens? Okay, so just to answer that particular question, there are 4 ways to make cardholder data unreadable, right? As part of the standard, and that remains, which is hashing, encryption, truncation, and tokenization. Now, all of us are aware that, if you're basically talking about your scope and if you're predominantly talking about tokenization, it all depends whether, who's generating these particular tokens and how are these tokens getting stored. Now, if you can reconstruct the original PAN from that particular token, then yes, you will have to go ahead and do this particular piece. But if it is provided by, the token is provided to you by a third party, and in that particular case, you're predominantly out of scope from this assessment because you cannot reconstruct the original PAN. So it all depends on how your card data can be reconstructed based on these mechanisms which come into the picture, right? So just to reiterate the entire crux on multi-factor authentication that is coming, the requirement is very simple. It says earlier it was with administrators with non-console access to CDE, it was only admin, but now it's for all users who have access to the cardholder data environment. And with respect to authenticated scans, again, it is mandated as part of version 4.0 that you have to basically perform authenticated scans for internal vulnerability assessment, has to be authenticated. Please remember earlier, when I was also doing my particular assessments and audits, we emphasize this from a security standpoint, because if you look into the vulnerabilities which showcase from an authenticated to a non-authenticated scan, it's going to be huge, right? But now the standard demands for an authenticated scan. And this is something which is very, very important. So, yeah. Can we move forward, please? Yes. So this particular question, I think this is something which is again very important because data discovery, we're not talking about just about card data, but yes, I understand PCI talks about predominantly card data. But this question generally, I'm talking about data discovery and how significant is it from version 4.0. So I think, I'll basically again ask this particular question to Rahman. So what do you think in terms of data discovery and the scanning piece, which is important?
So by the way, this is not a new requirement, right? Which means that there's already a part of our existing PCI DSS requirement. What we need to understand is the objective of the data discovery and why is it so important in the world of PCI, right? Today, one of the highest or the biggest risk an organization relates is with respect to how and where your data is residing, right? Most of the time we see, you're going to talk about data, I'm talking predominantly on the cardholder data, right? It is residing on undisclosed storage points, right? Unintentional, and sometimes it might be an accidental storage of card data, which might also be a top reason for any breach or any incident to happen, right? So the objective is to prevent, right? So in order to mitigate this risk, as an organization, we have to go ahead and identify methods and means to identify and securely delete the cardholder data, right? So wherever not required to be stored beyond a particular timeline or retention conditions basis the business need, this has to be taken into consideration, right? So few tips which can share would be like in terms of, I know some of the questions might come across in the chat window. So proactively, I just want to share a few inputs here. One is the scope of your data discovery, right? this should be organization-wide. Just ensure it is across your entire organization. Don't just limit the scope only to your PCI DSS scope environment, that's your CDA environment, right? In many cases, you'll go ahead and notice that, you'll be to your surprise that, hey, you found some cardholder data into a place which is not supposed to be found, right? So that the scoping is very, very important. The other piece is in terms of when your data might reside on different platforms, right? Most of the time as an organization, we feel, oh, we have implemented this technology, we have implemented this method, right? So it is not required. We have prevention controls and things around that. But you need to ensure you might implement a lot of your DLP controls and things around that, but it all depends on the version in terms of what rules you have implemented there, right? Sometimes you will be surprised that some controls might not even go ahead and address your databases, your operating systems, your mailboxes, your voice platforms. So be clear, running those CDD scans are very, very important to the success and maintaining that across. Just to conclude that, very important point is like most of the time, when and how to run the scans, right? It's very important tip is to just say, ensure that you run those scans when there's no impact to production. That is your lean hours, right? So that's what I can talk predominantly on data discovery.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rahman. Yeah, Nitin, you want to add something on data?
Yeah, so I think one interesting thing, if the stakeholders would have been looking at version 3.2.1 and 4.0 and compare it as a standard. So there's one section that we have exclusively added is the guidance. Now, I will add on to what Rahman just said, and I'll read out. I'm just opening that standard. It talks about in the guidance for requirement number 3.2.1. Which is for the defined approach. I'm just taking the requirements in the testing procedure. And the guidance it says, a data discovery tool or methodology can be used to facilitate identifying all sources and location of PAN and to look for PAN that resides on systems and network outside the currently defined CDE or in unexpected places within the defined CDE, for example, in an error log or memory dump file. So this approach can help ensure that previously unknown locations of PANs are detected and that the PAN is either eliminated or properly secured. So looking at the guidance, and I think it's important that you explore options how you should be able to detect and find the PAN in the environment, which is in clear text format, so that you are able to protect that and meet the certain requirements of the standard with the new guidance that we have provided. So I would request every stakeholder on the call today to go through the guidance along with when you are reading the requirements. This is going to help you and choose how you are going to approach to meet the certain requirements of the standard, whether by using tools or technologies or by other ways, whatever your QSs today propose you to do.
Awesome. I think fantastic. That's well answered. Just basically from the QSA standpoint, I would like to add a few pointers in terms of data discovery. I think because doing audits for organizations across the world, right? So I've also got this particular question coming in back and forth. People asking me that, Prajwal, do I have to run a data discovery tool across my organization? Do I have to limit it within my particular PCI scope and so on and so forth? So the only question that I go about asking people is, hey, how do you know that you have to limit it within the PCI scope? How do you know that your data just resides within that particular PCI scope, right? So the intent of doing a data discovery tool is to identify locations where card data is present. If you tell me I'm a typical small organization with 3 or 4 servers, I'm writing a particular script and so on and so forth, and I can do that, fantastic. But let's assume take organizations which are operating with more than 1,000 servers and so on and so forth. You don't know where exactly data is present. Data can be present in your logs, your files, your reports, databases, so on and so forth. It can be present anywhere. And also there's a requirement which comes into the picture from the standard that you should have a quarterly process of deleting the cardholder data after a set retention period. Okay, now that is also important. So now the pain point here is if I do not know where my data resides, if I do not know how the data is basically protected and so on and so forth, then how will I basically ensure that this particular data retention policy is structured in the right way and I delete it over a particular period of time? The standard mandates quarterly process of deleting cardholder data after a set retention period. Now people come back to me again, question me saying that, Prajwal, can you define a retention period? No, because the retention period is based on the local law of land. The standard never says that, okay, you have to have a retention period specified, say, for 1 year or 2 years or 5 years. No, it depends on the local law of land. But what the standard mandates is after a set retention period, you should have a quarterly process of deleting this particular cardholder data. So it's a request, please emphasize on data discovery, because again, based on our forensic investigation, like I rightly mentioned in my previous slide, that being top 4 global forensic investigators, we've seen entities, actually breached on the entire piece as well. Why? Predominantly because they do not know where data resides at the moment. So that's why it's very important for you to basically have data discovery, right? So this is in a nutshell. So let's move forward, please. Yeah. So within this question, is more from a standard perspective, I think a lot of people on this particular forum are also keen on this. And when I basically do my sessions across as well, on 4.0 and the changes, people come up saying that what is the flexibility? Because one of the goals of the standard as well is that, right? It basically talks about providing a flexibility. So now people come back saying that, Prajwal, do you mean that if I'm giving you the flexibility, are you saying that I do not have to implement the control? I think that understanding is wrong. Right, because where people are coming into the picture is more from a targeted risk analysis. It's more from a security posture, how you implement it based on the risk. So what are your takes when you talk about a customized approach and a defined approach?
So let me tell you one thing. I think I'll give you the difference between the defined and customized approach, but I think let me just clarify, the traditional methods for validating the PCI DSS are not going away with version 4.0. Now, entities with the controls in place that meets the PCI DSS requirements stated and that are comfortable with the current methods for validating how PCI DSS requirements are met can continue to use the defined approach. Now, what type of organization do you think should consider customized approach or defined approach? So let me start with defined approach. So the defined approach supports the entities with controls in place that meet PCI DSS requirements as stated in the standard. This approach may also suit to the entities that want more direction about how to meet the security objectives, also including entities who are new to information security or even to the PCI DSS standard. Now, which type of organization should be considering customized approach? Now, this approach, customized approach, is intended for entities with having robust security processes and strong risk management practices. Now, including but not limited to a dedicated risk management department or an organization-wide risk management approach. So these are the two different scenarios where the organizations should consider themselves using defined approach and the customized approach. Now there is another question that comes up: can an organization use a combination of the defined approach and the customized approach? Now, most of the PCI DSS requirements can be met using either defined or customized approach. However, the several requirements do not have a stated customized approach objective. The customized approach is not an option for these requirements. Now, entities can use both the defined and customized approaches within the environment. This means, if I have to put it, this means that an entity could use the defined approach to meet some requirements and use customized approach to meet the other requirements. This also means that an entity could use the defined approach to meet a given PCI DSS requirements for one system component or within one environment, and use the customized approach to meet the same PCI DSS requirement for a different system components or within a different environment. Now, in this way, a PCI DSS assessment could include both the defined and the customized approach. Now, that's how the users of the defined approach and the customized, or a combination of a defined approach and a customized approach, works. Now, who determines whether an entity uses the customized approach is another big question that these stakeholders ask us. Now, this is a decision for each entity based on entity's choice to implementing something other than the defined approach to achieve the requirements defined objective. Now, entities have to work here with their QSA and their acquirer, whichever the case, is to ensure, if you are an acquirer already, then you have to work with your QSA. If you are not an acquirer, you are a merchant or an IT service provider, you need to still work with your QSA and your acquirer based on the scenario to ensure the approach meets the requirements set forth in the PCI DSS for the customized approach and is acceptable by relevant stakeholders. So that's the difference between a defined approach and a customized approach is, and who should look these as an option is what I just spoke, and who is going to define the customized approach as an option. It's something also we just highlighted. Prajwal, over to you.
I think Nitin, fantastic. Thank you so much for that particular heads up. Also, just to highlight on this particular piece, please remember there are multiple aspects to this. You have a defined approach. You have something called as a customized approach. Now, again, there is something called as a compensating controls. Now, because a lot of people, when I'm doing my particular, like trainings and when I'm doing these particular seminars and webinars, they come across this particular question that, hey, Prajwal, you know what? Can I go ahead and use a compensating control for a customized approach piece, right? So now this is not possible because a compensating control basically comes towards a defined approach. A compensating control cannot be used with the customized approach because the customized approach focuses on something called as TRA. So, which is called as a targeted risk analysis. Earlier, if you see the version 3.2.1 of the standard was saying that you have to perform this particular risk assessment on an annual basis. That was requirement 12.2. To be precise. But now that particular requirement, from now they moved it into the targeted risk analysis. And that's where Nitin was rightly highlighting that you should have a risk department to oversee the entire governance of these particular controls and whether, you're looking into the risk aspect of not implementing, it's not about just go ahead and say, hey, you know what, I'm not going to implement this particular control, but because I don't see a risk which is basically associated with not implementing. No. My question is, have you done a thorough risk analysis? Have you done a TRA? What is the frequency? What are the other stuff that you have in place, right? So this is something which is very important. And also in the interest, for everybody on this particular forum, the reporting structures or the reporting document which has come in as well, you've got sections where if a particular requirement is in place with a defined or a customized approach, that has to be notified and that should be clearly defined in the reports as well. So that is something also which is very, very important when we go ahead with this particular definition. And just to add on before I hand it over to Nitin for a few pointers as well, there's another important aspect. Please remember, like how the scope, from a QSA standpoint, maybe organizations can define the particular scope, but the validation of the scope is done by the QSA. Likewise, when you're defining this particular risk aspect of it and you're going ahead on the targeted risk analysis, maybe you can define these particular controls and so on and so forth, but it is up to the particular QSA to define testing guidance for these particular TRAPs. Because whenever you're going into that particular vertical, it is on the leverage of the individual QSA to define testing procedures and guidance for the targeted risk analysis, which is taken using a customized approach. So this is something which is very, very important. And please remember, you have to basically talk to your QSAs before going into this particular methodology. Yeah, Nitin, off to you. Anything you want to add?
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly add what you talk about on the compensating control and the customized approach. So compensating controls, I think many of the stakeholders on this call would be aware of. These are used for the entities that cannot meet a requirement due to a business or a technical constraint. Now, and the customized approach is to be used for entities that have an innovative approach to meet the objective of the requirement in a different way. Now, the entity who chooses to implement a different control that meets the customized approach objective, but the controls may not meet the specifics in the PCI DSS requirement itself. No, the customized approach requires entity, which I just highlighted a few minutes back, is having a strong risk management practices and can document exactly how the approach meets the required objective. Now, there is one quick point that I want to add for the compensating controls. There has been some clarification that has been added. Now, the compensating controls cannot be used to retroactively address a requirement that was missed in the past while you are doing an annual validation. Right, so that's something that the stakeholders have to take into consideration. For example, let me put it in with an example where a task that should have been performed was not performed and no action was taken at the time to address it. Is what I'm meaning about the compensating control cannot be used retroactively to address that certain requirement when you are on the verge of your final annual validation process. Now, for the customized approach, there has been an appendixes. There are two appendices that are added, D and E in the standard, that provides the detailed process of completing the customized approach and also provides a template for entity to complete the control metrics and the risk analysis template, which is the TRA, which just Prajwal highlighted. So that's the thing that you should take into consideration while you are choosing compensating controls or using customized approach. These are added only to add flexibility to different methodologies that you're using to meet the PCI DSS requirements.
Perfect, Nitin. I think that is rightly said. And also just to add on to one particular point out here, your compensating controls, when you define them also, it should be above and over your PCI DSS requirements, which means there's more security and more, implementation piece of it on that as well, right? So that is something which is also very, very important when you're going ahead. The only thing what I'm basically talking to you about is obviously I see a lot of questions which has come in and, a lot of clarifications, but in the interest of time, I'm going to keep it as minimal as possible. But you can get in touch with us, to understand this more in terms of what are the controls, what are the implementations, and so on and so forth. Okay. So let's quickly move forward, please. So this is, I think, one of the questions which has come into the picture, and I was seeing the questions on the forum. People are asking me what are new requirements or new changes except for multi-factor authentication which has come in. Just to give you a small heads up, I told you the document is readily available on the PCI DSS website with respect to the changes that has come. What are the new requirements which has come into the picture? You can look into that. We are only covering, a few requirements out of the ones which has come into the picture as part of 4.0, which we feel is very important for organizations to follow. And this is a pain point as on there. So having said that, this is something that I also want to emphasize on. We just spoke about data discovery. We spoke about multi-factor authentication. And the last one that I have on this particular forum as well is, what are the new requirements which come into the picture in terms of log monitoring and incident response? I think this is something which is very, very important, and in the interest of time as well as audience, let's keep this real quick. So Rahman, if you can quickly in a minute explain about this, and then I'll hand it over to Nitin before I close the call.
Yeah, thanks. In fact, SIM and incident response are like, which you can talk for hours together. Just to try to keep it very simple, right? The new requirement is audit logs to be automated, which means to say that what are the mechanisms which we need to put in place to detect, alert, and also promptly address failures of critical security controls, right? So it all depends on the SIM tool which your organization is using, right? Some of them have predefined templates or algorithms which can be used to do that across, but some places you need to write a customized code or a script. So you need to go in full fledged to go ahead and do this implementation there, right? And what is very, very important here is we need to ensure the log reviews are diligent and versatile. So these two things is what you have to keep in back of your mind. And also now, before the QSA starts coming and asking you to show evidences, right? What is more important is to start thinking in terms of what are your ways to bring some ticketing mechanism, automatically assign some tickets so that, yeah, this log review would happen. This is when it happened. This is when it occurred. This is the time to close it across. It's also very important for us to start simulating that across, right? So start simulating across, call for a meeting, quick meeting to see how many people join on time and things around that. That's very, very important from an SIM perspective. And talking about incident response now, again, the requirements have been changed, right? Because earlier, if you talk about security incident, it's where the QS is to come and audit. Okay, did you have an incident in the past? In case there was an incident in the past, is when days to review it. Now, regardless of whether you had an incident or not, whether it was a suspected or a false positive, we have to deal with that, right? In terms of what is your incident response, right? Your playbook is very, very important right now in terms of your procedures. How do you address your timeline for addressing of these issues? Who's going to address those issues? Who are the roles, responsibilities? Their roles and responsibilities again plays a very, very important role here.
Fantastic. I think rightly mentioned, you're talking about playbooks, you're talking about automated process in terms of monitoring. That's a requirement as well, which is come into the picture. Incident response, just to add on, I think now there's a new requirement as well in the standard, which says that you identified cardholder information, but then over a period of time, when you're doing your revalidation, if there's a mechanism where you identify PAN in plain text, then you should basically follow incident responses to why it was not identified prior, right? And retainership and so on and so forth comes into the picture. Nitin, any closing remarks on this particular requirement?
No, I think you guys have covered. I think we are running short on time. I won't take that. Only thing that I just want to tell, if you have not started your journey on PCI DSS version 4.2, start now. And if you are looking forward to get more inputs from the council, you should look forward to joining council as a participating organization and keep getting yourself aware, trained. I think that's the only way out where you can meet the requirements of PCI DSS with the right intent and accomplish the dates that we have set for the industry to migrate or transition back to version 4.0.
Yep. So that's pretty much. So let's move forward. I think this was the last question which came into the picture. Now I know there's question and answers, but we're already running short of time. I know this is the most hottest topic which is there with version 4.0 coming into the picture. A lot of questions, a lot of clarifications. But yes, I will go back. I will take all these particular questions. I see if cardholder system incident only shall be QSA shall be called, or who should be called for all of this and so on and so forth. I will definitely look into these particular questions and we'll get back to each of you individually on these. There's a quick poll that has come into the picture. If you can, I'll give you like say 30 seconds. If you can quickly just answer these particular questions, on the poll, that is going to be great. And post this particular thing, I will end the webinar. So just quick 30 seconds. If you basically quickly can answer these poll questions, please. All right, I think that's pretty much. So thank you so much. Also, just to highlight, I know when you were basically registering for this particular webinar as well, you had a lot of questions which came into the picture, as to what we're going to be covering and if these questions can be answered. We'll definitely get back to you with those questions as well. If in case, those were not answered, then we'll get back to you individually. Before I end this particular webinar as well, just to give you a small heads up, we've come up with something called as the cohort-based training. This is in terms of how the entire PCI DSS journey towards 4.0 has to come into the picture and how do we implement this. I think this is something which is also very important. So you can reach out to any of us and we'll help you with this. Like, it's a particular training in terms of their entire transition that comes in and how do you basically transition your journey from version 3.2.1 to version 4.0 and what are the requirements, what are the changes and what are the challenges. So you can get in touch with us and, you can go through that particular cohort-based training as well. And post that, if you have any questions or clarifications, you can feel free to reach out to us. So with that, thank you so much for your time. We are, I think, running ahead by a minute. So thank you, Nitin. Thank you, Rahman, for your time. I think it was fantastic and looking forward to see you guys once again on this particular forum. And like what Nitin rightly mentioned, when we connect back in 2024, I think I'm going to go back and say, Nitin, this webinar, everybody started implementing 4.0 from the time we finished this webinar, which was the intent and the takeaway as well. So thank you very much. Thanks to all the participants. Like I already mentioned, we'll get back to you individually, with your particular questions. Have a great day. Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Take care. Bye-bye.